really excited to be part of the next panel, which is Translating Intent into Practice. The first speaker is Ms. Hilary Boulay Green, who began her career as a defense scientist following the completion of a master's in cellular and molecular medicine. And she joined the radiobiology group at the Defense Research and Development Canada's, that's the DRDC, Ottawa Research Center in 2007. In 2016, she transitioned from the bench, moving to DRDC's corporate headquarters in the role of project director for chemical, biological, and radiological medical countermeasures, expanding her responsibility to the entire CBRNE Defense S&T program in 2018. She is currently serving as the acting director for the People S&T program within the DRDC. Hilary, please.
All right, good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. So I'd like to start with the explicit disclaimer that I am by no means a human factors engineer, but I'm happy to present to you today on behalf of the great team that pulled this presentation together. Just a brief outline of today's talk. And so the Canadian Armed Forces have had a long and rich history to integrating women into service, starting with the nursing sisters of the Canadian Army in World War I. We saw the largest employment of females during World War II. However, those numbers were greatly reduced when hostilities ceased. In the 1970s, roles began to expand outside the traditional ones to include aircraft mechanics, air traffic controllers, military police, and firefighters. And as the human rights movement happened and the Canadian Human Rights Act came into play, role expansion happened with all trades being open to females. And as of 2001, every trade is now open to any person, regardless of sex and gender. As of late, females served in combat roles during the Afghanistan years with an important milestone of Captain Nicola Goddard, who was the first female killed in combat in Afghanistan in 2006. As some of my colleagues have already shown, women represent a relatively small number within the Canadian Armed Forces. However, that number is climbing. This data set's from 2019-2020, where we hit the important milestone of 16% overall, and as of 2022, that number's climbed to 16.4%. In 2016, the serving Chief of Defense Staff set a target to have females represent 25% of the CAP by 2026, which is a pretty lofty goal, and clearly we still have some ways to go. So despite our attempts to increase representation of females in the Canadian Armed Forces and complete integration, there's still a number of challenges females in the military face when it comes to operational clothing and equipment. There have been multiple social science studies that have been conducted over the past 25 years, but unfortunately they all show the same results. A study by Davis in 1997, which surveyed serving members, female members, showed that the majority of women expressed concern with poorly fitting uniforms and equipment. This same perception was repeated in the results of Rutchinsky et al. In a study that was done in 2018, so 20 years later. One of the biggest challenges is that clothing equipment is designed on unisex, or to be unisex. But what that really means is that it's the lack of data on female morphology and physiology, that operational clothing and equipment is designed around the male shape, but simply shrunk down. I think we can all agree that a small man does not necessarily equate the female form. Ill-fitting clothing and equipment increases barriers to attraction, recruitment, and retention in females, and can be a safety concern. So while there are a few challenges, and a number of them we'll dive into in the subsequent slides, unfortunately due to the lack of time today, we won't be able to touch on the fourth, but though it's not insignificant, the lack of physiological data where female service members are concerned and its integration to clothing equipment does remain a challenge as well. So historically, the lack of sex disaggregated data has caused a bias in clothing and equipment design. Body armor provides an excellent case study in this regard, and there are several issues with Canada's combat body armor for females. Driven by the fact that the plates are the wrong size, again, designed on using measurements for males because there was limited data for females. It reduces shoulder mobility for females and smaller males because it is wider on their chest, making it more difficult to get their arms around and put magazine pouches in tactical vests. As a result, females suffer shoulder strain injuries of having to force their arm to bend around the plates. The plate reduces dorsiflexion and extension because it covers more of the spine for females than for males. The plates are relatively heavier for females, which can have greater impact on their speed of maneuver, increase their chances of being shot, and perhaps putting them at a performance disadvantage. The plates also sit differently on a female torso and as a result of breast and can cause breast discomfort and pain when prone. But this is changing. Multiple militaries around the world, including some of our allies here, have recognized this issue and are pursuing female-specific body armor. Canada is also following suit. Defence Research Development Canada has a robust research program in this vein to conduct testing and evaluation to better understand ballistic protection for women. Some of these activities are listed here, and understanding things like the impact of ricochet and curved plate response will be critical to informing requirements for female protective equipment. An additional challenge is that the anthropometric models are outdated, nor necessarily representative, and this has been a challenge for clothing equipment and design. There were two key surveys that have been conducted in the past, listed here. One that was the anthropometric survey by the land forces, done in 1996 and 97. And you can see that there was about 34% of females in that particular survey. So it was oversampled. There was better representation of the Canadian population, but this data is now older and no longer representative of the population it serves. However, it was extensively used for our Clothed Soldier program, which is what a lot of our in-service equipment was based on. The second study was more recent, had a much larger sampling of members, however, lower number of females at only 14%. So while it did achieve gender representation to females in the military at that time, it was not representative of the Canadian population and no longer doesn't represent the changing demographics. So on top of outdated data, the problem is compounded by poor translation of these limited data to industry for production. Industry doesn't have access to these data sets, and therefore manufacturing sizing is often based on whatever data they have available, which may or may not represent the Canadian population, let alone the Canadian female. Secondarily, assessment of fit is only ever occasionally done during the procurement process and may not have been taken into consideration. So as a solution, updating the anthropometric models would be a good start. The Canadian Armed Forces have a long history of using digitized anthropometrics. There was a body sizing system, for those of you that may have been familiar, back in the late 90s. They were supplied in clothing supply depots across the country as a replacement for having a tailor to physically measure the member. These systems were not interconnected. The data was not centrally stored, so they're now obsolete. At present, however, the CAF is pursuing a program for procurement and installation of 3D whole body scanners, which will be interconnected to a secure database and to have that data stored centrally. The intent is that every member will be required to be scanned on some kind of routine, so likely in coordination with their routine fitness tests or perhaps medicals. And if this project is successful, it will enable evolving evergreening representational database of full diversity for body shape and sizes across the CAF. There are, however, some very significant challenges to overcome, including data integrity, data security and privacy, data management and accuracy, as well as acceptance and trust of the system. And while these problems may take some time, institutionalizing this will overcome a lot of the operational challenges we see. And of course, DRDC is supporting that data validation. An additional challenge is the representation for females. We know that soldiers are busy doing workups or courses, getting ready for deployment, and often user trials are just a grab bag of who's available at the time. Given we have a small representation of women in the CAF at large, it may mean that some of these user trials have very little to none participation in there, and so therefore that female-centric data is not collected. To increase female representation, research may need to deliberately oversample to ensure sufficient representation. And the building of networks that we've seen has been super helpful, where we have women advisory groups that include a tech net of women in the combat arms that support to augment participation in trials and surveys to ensure that that female-centric data is being captured to inform next generation operational clothing. As an alternate approach to collect female data, our research teams are using simulators that can be adapted to represent female morphology. We heard the use of modifying mannequins to that effect, but we're using simulators where we can simulate that. An example being what we're doing in load carriage, where we can do testing on female shape mannequins without having to actually recruit participants. Of course, the application of gender-based analysis plus is an additional measure. And just to touch on that briefly, so these are tools developed, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that provide structure and guidance questions to analyze procurement policy issues from a gender or a sex perspective, plus other diversity perspectives, with the goal to identify issues early so that they can be mitigated if needed. At present, these tools are used or applied to all CAF D&D procurement and policy decisions. And on the research side, the intent is and the desire is also there to apply that same methodology, asking researchers to apply GPA plus considerations from their study design right through to data collection. There's a lot of writing on this slide. I appreciate that. Probably too small to print, meant to be a snapshot of the efforts that are happening within Defence Research and Development Canada in this space, all with the goal of broadening and looking at our what we call soldier systems to include diversity. So not only from a female perspective, but really for religious accommodation and to make sure that we are prepared to accommodate a diverse force. So in summary, Canada's movement towards integrating women into the armed forces has been ongoing for over a century. But despite these efforts, operational clothing and equipment design is still lagging for females. But the good news is that research and development is moving towards helping to provide some of these effective solutions. And hopefully we will see moving there. So I will stop there. Happy to take any questions in the panel, or you can find me afterwards. So thank you.
The next speaker is Colonel Michelle Solstice, who currently serves as the Chief Consultant to the U.S. Army Surgeon General in Falls Church, Virginia, and is the chairperson of the Joint Preventive Medicine Policy Group. As a preventive medicine physician, she has had the privilege to serve as the director of the Public Health Directorate in the Office of the Army Surgeon General, as the director of the Public Health Residency Program at Madigan Army Medical Center in Tacoma, Washington, and as a preventive medicine officer with the 10th Mountain Division in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Colonel Solstice earned her Doctor of Medicine degree of Public Health and, earned her medical degree from the Pennsylvania State University College of Medicine and her Master's of Public Health degree from the University of Washington School of Public Health. She currently resides in Northern Virginia with her husband and her 10-year-old child. Now,
thank you. Good afternoon, and again, thank you for the invitation and just the opportunity to share with you what's going to be a very brief introduction to our work with public health policy, what we do with the Joint Preventive Medicine Policy Group. Now, I know that I just said work, and while I do recognize that there are many working groups out there that are endeavoring just absolutely tirelessly to improve the many facets of military medicine, the Joint Preventive Medicine Policy Group is the military health system's only policy group. So again, like the other speakers, I have no financial disclosures to make here today, no other potential conflicts of interest to disclose, and these are my views. Just a brief agenda. We'll start with a very brief introduction and move on throughout the presentation. As I know many of us who are in the room right now and online already know, and of course as we continue to share the word in our work, it's those very comprehensive preventive medicine and public health activities and programs, which again are just absolutely fundamental in promoting and in maintaining our force health protection and in improving the readiness of our service members. Preventive medicine touches just so many parts and pieces of the care that we render to our service members, our families, and our retirees. And it really is just absolutely essential to our ability to maintain both the medically ready force and the ready medical force. The Joint Preventive Medicine Policy Group functions primarily as a consultative body, which is comprised of various DoD subject matter experts, which provides policy recommendations to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Readiness Policy and Oversight, and both in coordination with and at the direction of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. We do develop draft policy recommendations on matters of force health protection. It's important to note that the group's recommendations are non-binding and offered only for the consideration of the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Assistant Secretary, and they may be accepted and adopted in whole, they may be adapted in part, or they may be altogether disregarded. So we do have a number of voting members that we include. They include representatives from the Army, from the Navy, from the Air Force, from the Coast Guard. We have representatives joining us as voting members from the Joint Staff Surgeon's Office, as well as from the Defense Health Agency. And of note, Dr. Costello, who you've met here this morning, she's previously served as our Air Force representative. We also do welcome a number of non-voting members, ad hoc members, and other invited guests from around the military health system. And we do rely on their absolutely extraordinary expertise to inform our evidence-based reviews and our discussions. Dr. Rossi, he currently serves as our group's Canadian military medical representative and absolutely just helps us to continue to cultivate the incredible partnership between and among our members. So this is just a very brief visual break. As some of you might know, I do like to inject a little bit of sometimes pub trivia into discussions, but I've been inspired to go a different direction today by the National Gallery across the street, the wonderful exhibits that you have here at the embassy. And so these visual breaks will include just a few quick glimpses of paintings that portray women who are struggling or confronted by public health issues of historical importance. So just very quickly, this is Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth, who hails from close to the same neck of the woods in Pennsylvania as I do. Does anyone know, yes, audience participation, it's late in the afternoon. Does anyone know which now vaccine preventable disease it was believed the subject of this work suffered from? Polio. And now critics today are saying maybe it wasn't polio, maybe it could have been Charcot-Marie tooth disease, but no, polio is the common conception here. The group's primary responsibility is to provide, of course, informed, executable policy recommendations through the evaluation of relevant research and the assessment of available evidence. Our group evaluates and recommends, again, evidence-based clinical and community preventive services, which are specific to our military populations. So although we try to operate in the same vein, in the same spirit as groups such as the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, again, recommendations are very specific to our military family. We inform and exchange policy, programs, and best preventive medicine practices. We do try to contribute to operational policies, and we may even comment on select manpower or equipment questions too. We do recommend research priorities. We promote interoperability and standardization of procedures when we can, and we do also try to identify policy gaps and opportunities for practice improvement. We do also assist with analyses and reviews as we're directed to by the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Assistant Secretary. With assistance from our many partners, the group may monitor operational and organizational changes to assess the abilities to keep our forces healthy. We try to, again, make those recommendations to meet current or anticipated needs. And we do continually review policies and, again, recommend revisions to ensure both currency and continued relevancy. All right, another quick visual break. So this one is L'Etibage. That's probably about the extent of my French. I apologize. But here we do see mother and child who are impacted by a condition of, again, public health importance. Anyone, again, audience participation, anyone know this now vaccine preventable disease that the child who's pictured here has fallen victim to and is being treated for? Diphtheria, yes. Excellent. And in the same vein, this piece by Edvard Munch, not his most famous work for sure, but this is illustrative of the struggles and the heartbreak faced by mother and child due to, again, you guessed it, another issue of public health importance. Anyone know what the child here is suffering from? Has anyone seen this painting before? The sick child. Yes, tuberculosis. So again, just to quickly provide a very brief overview of some of the examples of our group's work. And again, this is upon reviewing the application of available evidence to our specific populations, again, our specific populations, and evaluating the risks and the benefits of proposed pathways. We've recommended a number of different issues, from everything from adenovirus vaccine in congregate settings. We've talked about and contributed to the recently published recommendations on tick-borne encephalitis vaccine. We've reviewed HIV screening intervals for our service members. And of course, you may have guessed we might have been a little bit busy over the last few years, providing a number of recommendations during the pandemic. We did provide recommendations on the concurrent administration of COVID-19 vaccine and other immunizations, such as smallpox vaccine. We did discuss COVID-19 vaccine booster immunizations, the prioritization of PPE for our healthcare workers, our first responders, and other installation personnel in the very early days of the pandemic. We talked about the risks posed by COVID-19 during operational exercises. We even discussed COVID-19 serology testing. I know I said I would make this quick. So we have focused too on a number of issues that are very specific to women, such as the COVID-19 vaccine recommendations and approaches to risk communication for pregnant and breastfeeding women, as well as women with other reproductive concerns. The group has also reviewed guidance on HPV vaccine and recommendations for that vaccine for our female service members. So just in closing, I know some feel that this work by Toulouse-Lautrec doesn't exactly paint women perhaps in the most flattering light. However, other critics do say that this is a great example of women taking control of their own health. This is a painting called The Medical Inspection, and it does depict suffering due to syphilis. Certainly, again, a public health disease of great importance, both then and now. And finally, I'll leave you with a work from the 19th century, which absolutely celebrates the strength of women, as here it's women who are fighting the public health scourge of cholera. And so, again, just may we too continue to celebrate the strength of women, both in fighting disease and in preserving, I should say, our fighting strength. Thank you so much.
Okay, and for our final speaker in this panel, who needs no introduction because she has previously been introduced earlier today, Dr. Hoffmeyer.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the chance to speak with you again. Let's move quickly through the disclosures. I still have no authority to represent the United States government or the policy thereof, and I have no financial interest to disclose or conflict of interest. So we're going to begin today with another overview of behavioral health disparities. I'm going to briefly touch on the barriers to the collection of sexual orientation, gender identity data. We'll talk a little bit about our efforts to support our LGBT community, and then quickly summarize the wave tops of the policy. So let's begin with the behavioral health disparities. So I have here some data from the Millennium Cohort Study. You may be familiar with this. This is one of the biggest studies that we do, and it's been ongoing for quite some time. So here we have a breakdown of PTSD, depression, and comorbid PTSD depression, but it's broken down by gender and sexual orientation. So we have here on the left, we have female, starting with heterosexual females, then gay and lesbian females, and then finally bisexual individuals. And then for males, we have a repeat of that order. So heterosexual males, and then gay males, and then bisexual. So we have at the top no PTSD or depression, then we have depression alone, PTSD alone, and then comorbid PTSD and depression. So I want you to draw your attention here that for bisexual men and women, the rates of depression alone, PTSD alone, and comorbid PTSD depression are double that of their heterosexual counterparts. That's a pretty dramatic difference in terms of their PTSD and depression, kind of the hallmarks of trauma exposure. And then if we go on to the next slide, we have the very same format in terms of heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and then bisexual. But here we're looking at anxiety and panic attacks and problematic anger. So at the top here, we have no panic or anxiety, then panic or anxiety, no problematic anger, and then problematic anger. And we see the same pattern emerge. Still is troubling this time. We see again that we have, for bisexual men and women, the rates of panic and anxiety and problematic anger are again about double those of heterosexual males and females. We also find that a significant portion, about 12% of the active duty component, did not endorse a heterosexual identification. So what I'm saying here is that they don't feel comfortable with the term heterosexual. They may be bisexual, they may be pansexual, there are other terms that they are using, but they didn't identify as heterosexual. Of those who identified as other than heterosexual, 43% are reporting sexual assault. So that's a significant ratio there. I think that we should be concerned and gearing services towards those who identify as other than heterosexual. So the next slide here, we have a little more detail. We're going to drill down a little bit. Again, nearly half of the men who were sexually assaulted in 2018 identify as other than heterosexual. And for women, we have a similar ratio. 40% of women sexually assaulted identify as other than heterosexual. So the take home here is that those who are in the queer communities are at greater risk for sexual assault. So I think that if we have a discussion about gender disparities, it's important to touch on a little bit of the data collection barriers that we experience when we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, because you may not be aware of these barriers. So I believe most of you are familiar with the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Is anyone not familiar with Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Okay. So when they repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2011, they also decided that we could not collect data on sexual orientation of gender or sexual orientation of service members. We think that intention behind that was protective, that we wouldn't have any secret lists of people that would make people uncomfortable or put them at risk. And then it was actually codified with DOTI 1328, which again says that we are not allowed to collect data about transgender or transgender related data or publicly release such data. Again, we believe this was done as a protective measure to keep folks safe so they would not be at risk. If you've been following transgender service members, the policy has changed several times in the last few years due to political reasons rather than data reasons. And so we believe that was a protective factor put in place. So we continue to have difficulty collecting data about sexual orientation and gender identity. So if you collect the data, in most instances, you're going to need a waiver from the Undersecretary of Defense and Personnel and Readiness. There are a few exceptions, and please note that this new policy exception only came about 6 weeks ago. It came out in December of 2022. So there are several areas. If it is prevention research and survey based, then you may be eligible to qualify for this exception. There are numerous restrictions that come along with this restriction. So you have to maintain confidentiality or have an anonymous design. And by that, they mean that they want you to actually have a certificate of confidentiality. They need you to use the standard items from the item bank. So for those of you who are not familiar with an item bank, for questions of a sensitive nature, they will often request a very specific verbiage of those questions that has been screened and reviewed by other SMEs. So they must use the questions that have already been approved through the item bank and of course have IRB approval. There are numerous other restrictions included, but that gives you kind of a sense of the importance of just one more hoop to go through for those of us who are doing this research. So let's talk about support for the LGBT community and end on a high note. So we have a Defense Health Agency Pride celebration that includes sometimes various speakers, panel events, just general support for the community. We also have the Behavioral Health Diversity Working Group. So we are tasked with supporting the mental health needs of women, the LGBT community, and the BIPOC or the Black, Indigenous, People of Color community. So we're busy. We co-host the mini residency. We also support medical personnel training and gender affirming care. So there is a medical personnel training that's required. We supported that, and also one focused on behavioral health providers in process. We have a SharePoint filled with resources, links, and blogs. And then, of course, we respond to leadership inquiries about research and help disseminate relevant research that comes to our attention. So our last accomplishment was the completion of 2 support tools. We had one on intersectionality that's been done for a few weeks, and we have a new one that is just about to get final approval, focused on gender affirming care for behavioral health providers, kind of a cheat sheet for those of us who don't do a lot of this work. And then we have a command tool, because command may not be familiar with the in-transition process. What are the steps? How does this work? How much time do I have to sign these forms, et cetera, et cetera. So that is in process as well, a commander's tool helping them to remember the laborious process for transition. So I'm going to wrap up quickly with policy. I believe you are all familiar that Executive Order 1400-004 required that we have all qualified individuals be able to serve in the military. And I support him in saying that an inclusive military strengthens our national security. And so in response, we did reenact DOTI 1328, focused on the in-service transition of transgender service members. Now the key here is that military medical clinics are prepared to provide medical care for all individuals with dignity and respect, and we are working to make that a reality in every way that we can. We are also working on mandatory trainings, which JKO is our online training environment. So we just got the transgender care training online yesterday, and another training is in the works, again, making sure that folks are up to speed and prepared to provide this care.
Okay, if I could have the speakers come up to take questions for this panel. Are there any virtual questions?
Yes, there is one from Lieutenant Colonel Barnhart. She says, "Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this very necessary conversation. 19 years of personal experience as a female serving in the U.S. Navy. I face many of the challenges that have been mentioned by the speakers today, as both a patient and provider. The question, how do you see our community's ability to push for dedicated women's health research and health and wellness efforts for gender-specific issues being affected by the evolving political environment surrounding determinants of health such as gender identity? In other words, how do we balance promoting specific populations within the active force while not increasing disparities and exclusivity? It was a long question. You need me to repeat that?
That's not going to help. Um, so I don't know if we can accomplish such lofty goals in my lifetime, or at least in my civilian career. So what I can do is focus on what's in front of me, and that is we really strive to be data driven. So in terms of prioritization, whose house is on fire the most is kind of our approach to helping and working on what we can work on. So I don't know that we can get to the outcome that you're talking about, but we can keep trying to move and following the data and going where the data leads us. I don't have a better answer than that.
I guess I would say I'm optimistic in that as we become more cognizant of some of these disparities, it affords us opportunities to take a closer look at some of those disparities. I know Dr. Costello, I just had the opportunity to sit in on some of her residents' presentations, their research. And I believe, I can't quite see with the lights, but one of her residents was doing a study on racial disparities among our female service members and their choice of LARC. Do I have that correct? Are you in the audience? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, citing your own work. Back to you. I yes, but no, I just was so again optimistic that more and more studies, more research like that can now be done now as we become more cognizant of some of those issues.
Is there another question?
Another question from Laura Stewart. Does DoD have positive space ambassadors?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Does DoD have positive space ambassadors?
So I would like to ask, what is a positive space ambassador?
Yeah.
So, positive space ambassadors promote diversity, awareness, and inclusion with a focus on the two LGBTQI plus communities. It allows people to speak openly and positively about gender and sexual diversity and provides assistance to others who are dealing with issues.
So we don't have that program. We do have a lot of information, and it is included in the mandatory trainings. This idea of creating an inclusive and welcoming space. So we talk a lot about small, what we call safety cues. So, for example, I'm wearing an ally pin that says I'm a safe person and that you can talk to me about anything in that space without having to deal with any of my straight stuff, right? And so there are lots of folks throughout the DoD who have this signage or other signage. Some of us have, background photos or signs or diversity flags in our offices. There's lots of ways for letting people signal that there is a safe space. We're also working to develop again handouts and materials that are inclusive that provide a lot of information and provide queer images so that people can see again my therapist, my provider understands my experience and what to do about it. And we've been training folks to introduce themselves with their pronouns. And we're also working on some other measures to, again, solidify that we are all welcome in this space and that we all want everyone to be safe in this space.
Any other comments? Okay. Yes, sir.
Here's
Next
a
question.
question. Is there a specific metric that is being used to assess any health issues specific to the LGBT community? Is there a metric to assess the issue?
Um, so I don't know of a metric specific, and again, we have some barriers to sexual orientation and gender identity data collection. So I know that there were a few studies that had waivers, but again, it couldn't be pertaining to their sexuality. All we can do is what happens is that we have a regular survey done, and then a couple of epidemiologists are able to go back in and do a secondary analysis post the study. So that's what we have in the data that I showed you, but there are numerous barriers to collecting data for the intention of assessing issues related to the queer community. Does that make sense?
Other question from online.
Okay, we'll take one more question. No more questions from you? No more? Okay, fantastic. So those were challenging questions. I think that clearly outlines the situation surrounding those policies and about the certain communities. And I think what's important to note here is that everyone that I know and every policymaker that I've been associated with have altruistic intent in order to make sure that we take care of everyone in the military and to take care of, to follow the orders of the president and also of our community in the whole. So the one thing, I know we focused a lot of our energy on that. I do want to note how interesting the first presentation was about the female specific armor that's being considered in Canada. I know most questions that I get asked by a lot of my female colleagues is, when are we finally going to get armor that's appropriate for the female body type? And to hear that the Canadian forces are considering that at this point in other countries around the world brings definitely a glimmer of hope that potentially we will address that in the future. So the time will tell. But thank you very much. I appreciate your time.